Under the orange glow of a Queens streetlight in the summer of 1956, a chubby 12-year-old kid named Joey Massino stood outside a corner candy shop, his eyes locked on the shiny Buick parked across the street. Inside the car sat three men in suits, smoking and laughing, their gold watches flashing whenever they gestured. They weren't movie stars or politicians. They were local wise guys, men who owned the neighborhood without needing to say it. Joey didn't know their names then, but he knew one thing. They had power. And power, he thought, meant never being pushed around again. He had grown up poor, the son of hard-working Italian immigrants who believed in quiet respectability. But Joey didn't want to fix cars or stock groceries like his father. He wanted to be somebody. He watched the men who walked the streets of Maspeth with confidence, never looking over their shoulders. They tipped bartenders with fives, not singles. They wore good shoes and always had someone waiting to open the door for them. As a teenager, Joey wasn't built for books. He was built for hustle. He cut classes, started running small errands for older guys, delivering envelopes, picking up numbers, keeping his mouth shut. By the time most kids were worried about high school dances, Joey was making more cash in a week than his teachers did in a month. He learned fast that loyalty and silence were currency more valuable than money. He met a kid named Sonny Red. One afternoon outside a social club, Sonny liked the way Joey kept his mouth shut and didn't flinch when things got tense. Soon, Joey was running small gambling operations in the back of bars, watching, listening, absorbing the rhythm of the underworld. Every time someone got pinched, Joey studied what mistake they'd made. Every time someone made a score, he took mental notes. Queens in the 1960s wasn't glamorous, but for men like Joey it was a playground. The Bonanno family had their fingers in everything: bookmaking, hijacking, construction kickbacks. Joey wasn't a made guy yet, but he moved like one. He had an easy smile and a calmness that made people underestimate him. Behind that calmness, though, was calculation. He started hijacking trucks off the Long Island Expressway. Cigarettes, liquor, electronics. The kind of work that made real money fast but could land you in serious trouble. Joey had a knack for planning, timing routes, paying off the right warehouse workers. It was risky, but the profits were clean. By 25, he had a small crew and a growing reputation for reliability. One night, after a successful job, Joey sat with his closest friends in a diner booth. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and excitement. "You know what makes guys like us last?" he said, stirring his coffee. "We don't talk. We don't show off. The loud ones go first." Everyone nodded. Joey wasn't the oldest in the group, but his words carried weight. Through the 1970s, the streets got louder, greedier. The drug trade was swallowing whole neighborhoods. Joey stayed away from that scene, not because he was moral, but because he was smart. Drugs brought heat, and heat brought prison. He preferred the steady profit of gambling and loan sharking, businesses that kept cash flowing without catching headlines. He married a quiet woman named Josephine, who worked in a local bakery before they settled in a modest home in Howard Beach. To the neighbors, Joey was just a man who loved his family and barbecues. To the people who knew better, he was a rising figure under Philip Rastelli, the Bonanno boss who respected Joey's discipline. When Rastelli went to prison in the late 70s, Joey's name started circulating more. He wasn't the type to take the front seat, but power has a way of finding men who understand patience. Other mobsters liked him because he wasn't greedy. He split profits fairly and remembered birthdays. He treated even small earners with dignity, a rare quality in that world. Then came Thurston Bonanno Civil War. The infamous period when factions within the family tore each other apart. Bodies dropped in parking lots. Social clubs turned into ambush sites. Joey stayed out of the fray, playing the long game. While others fought for territory, he strengthened alliances, kept business steady, and made sure money flowed up. When the dust settled, many of the old players were gone, and Joey was still standing, quiet, unscathed, and more powerful than ever. He began to envision a different kind of leadership. To him, the old mafia, loud suits, flashy cars, endless bragging, was outdated. The world was changing. Surveillance was everywhere. If the family was going to survive, it needed discipline. He started holding quiet meetings in diners instead of clubs, using coded language, rotating locations. His men called him the ear, because he listened more than he spoke. One evening, in the basement of a pizzeria he partly owned, Joey sat across from his closest confidant, Sal Vitale, his brother-in-law. "You know what kills this life?" Joey said, leaning back in his chair. "Ego. Guys forget we're supposed to be invisible. I want a family that lasts." Sal nodded, already knowing what Joey was building, a structure that could outlast any investigation, any raid. The money kept pouring in. Every Friday, envelopes arrived, cash from card games, construction deals, and loans. Joey wasn't the type to count bills with excitement. He cared about the system working smoothly. His men rarely argued. They feared him, but they also respected him. By the early 1980s, whispers began. People said Joey wasn't just a captain anymore. He was running the whole show. Restelli might have still been the official boss, but everyone knew who truly called the shots on the streets. Joey liked it that way. He didn't need the title. He needed the control. Late one night, he drove alone through Queens, the streets quiet, rain streaking across his windshield. He passed the same candy shop where he'd once watched those suited men laughing in their car. It was closed now, boarded up. He pulled over and looked at it for a long moment. So much had changed, yet he'd followed the same path. But unlike them, he promised himself, he wouldn't go down the same way. In his rearview mirror, the neon reflection of a bar sign flickered like a heartbeat. Joey smiled faintly, shifting into gear. Power was finally his, but he knew power was only safe if no one could see it. He drove off into the dark streets of Queens, already planning his next move. How to turn a criminal empire into something nearly invisible. Something that might, if he played it right, last forever. By the mid-1980s, Joey Massino had become a quiet storm inside the underworld. Everyone in New York's criminal circles knew his name, but few had ever sat across from him. He liked it that way. The fewer people who saw his face, the fewer who could talk. He wasn't the kind of boss who stood in front of cameras wearing gold chains and designer suits. Joey's power lived in whispers, not headlines. When Philip Restelli finally died in prison, the Bonanno family stood at a crossroads. Years of blood feuds and betrayals had left them fractured and disrespected. The commission, the mafia's ruling council, had once banned the Bonannos from meetings altogether, considering them too unstable. Joey wanted to change that. He wanted to make his family legitimate again in the eyes of organized crime. At his kitchen table one night, Joey sat with his wife, Josephine. She poured him coffee, the kind of quiet domestic moment that hid the weight of his world. "You always look like you're thinking about 10 things at once," she said softly. He smiled. "That's because I am." Josephine didn't ask questions. She never had. She knew her husband's business was best left unspoken, but she also knew he carried the burden of 1,000 moving parts. Men, money, loyalty, secrets. Joey began rebuilding the Bonanno family, like an architect. He structured the organization carefully, putting trusted men in charge of different territories and ensuring no one person had too much control. He avoided nepotism, preferring brains over bloodlines. His underboss was Sal Vitale, loyal, sharp, and family by marriage. But Joey never let sentiment cloud his decisions. If someone slipped, they were quietly replaced. One of his smartest moves was rebranding the family's image. "We don't talk, we don't brag, and we don't meet where microphones can hear us," he told his captains. The days of loud social clubs were over. He instructed his men to meet in diners, parks, or even on construction sites, always moving, never predictable. He banned them from saying his name, even in private. The boss became simply the man. This discipline worked. For the first time in decades, the Bonanno family was running smoothly. Their operations, gambling, loan sharking, restaurant kickbacks, and union deals, were making more money than ever. Joey's approach was old school in its roots, but modern in its methods. He believed the mafia could adapt and survive as long as it stayed smart and invisible. He even opened a legitimate business front, a restaurant called Casa Blanca in Queens. It was elegant but modest, a family-friendly Italian spot where locals came for Sunday dinners. To the neighborhood, it was Joey's pride and joy. To the FBI, it was a suspected meeting point for high-ranking members of the Bonanno family. But Joey was clever. He rarely appeared there himself. He let others run it while he conducted business elsewhere. Behind that calm exterior, Joey's world was shifting. The FBI had begun using new surveillance tactics, hidden cameras, wiretaps, and informants wearing recorders. Many mobsters were being caught in their own words. Joey understood this better than anyone. He'd seen great men fall because of careless talk, so he taught his men the art of coded speech. "If you gotta talk about business," he once said, "talk about baseball. Just make sure I can tell who's winning the game." He didn't trust easily, but when he did, he trusted deeply. His brother-in-law, Sal, was one of those rare few. They had built everything side by side, their bond like steel. Joey often said, "If Sal falls, I fall." Those words one day would haunt him. One autumn night, Joey gathered his top captains in a quiet backroom of a bakery in Maspeth. The air smelled of flour and coffee. He stood at the head of the table and spoke in his usual calm, measured tone. "We're not animals. We're businessmen. We keep our heads down, we stay loyal, and we take care of each other. That's how we win." The men nodded, hanging on every word. Joey's leadership wasn't built on fear. It was built on respect. He made everyone feel like a piece of something bigger, something that could outlast the chaos of the past. Within a few years, Joey's discipline paid off. Law enforcement noticed the Bonanno family wasn't showing the usual cracks. Their phone taps turned up nothing useful. Informants were terrified to talk. Money flowed quietly, cleanly. The other families began to see the Bonannos not as the broken faction of old, but as the most organized crew in New York. The commission, after years of exclusion, allowed them back into the fold. It was a major victory, a silent crown placed on Joey's head. To the outside world, Joey Massino was an unassuming man who loved cooking and family dinners. To the underworld, he was the last Don, the final example of what a real boss was supposed to be: strategic, loyal, and cautious. But inside that carefully built empire, cracks were starting to form. Success breeds envy, and envy breeds betrayal. Some of Joey's captains began growing restless. The world was changing fast. Younger guys wanted quicker money, riskier deals, and the kind of flash Joey despised. He could feel the shift in the air, like tension before a storm. He started noticing small things. Men whispering too quietly, envelopes arriving a little light, excuses piling up. One night he sat with Sal Vitale again. They were at Joey's kitchen table, the same one where so many plans had been made. "It's the new generation," Sal said. "They don't care about rules. They think they're smarter than everyone." Joey nodded slowly. "They forget who built this thing, but they'll remember soon enough." He still believed loyalty could fix anything. What he didn't know yet was that loyalty, the very foundation he'd built his empire on, was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. For now, though, the streets of Queens were quiet. The Bonanno family was strong, money was steady, and Joey Massino stood at the top of a rebuilt empire. But in the shadows, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. By the early 1990s, Joey Massino had achieved what many thought impossible. He'd turned the fractured Bonanno family into the most stable, profitable, and low-profile organization in New York. The other bosses respected him, the FBI couldn't catch him, and his men believed he could see 10 steps ahead of everyone else. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but Joey knew better than to ever relax. In his world, peace was only an illusion between storms. He'd wake early each morning, long before the sun came up, and sit alone at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. The sound of the refrigerator humming filled the silence. He'd go over names in his head, captains, associates, earner after earner, calculating who could be trusted, who might be drifting, who needed a reminder of where their loyalties lay. Joey treated leadership like chess. Every move had to be thought through before a single piece left its square. He had one rule that he repeated to his inner circle. The moment a man feels untouchable is the moment he's done. That rule had kept him alive and free when other bosses were falling left and right. The FBI's war on organized crime was relentless. RICO laws, hidden recorders, undercover agents, they were dismantling the mafia family by family. But Joey's organization remained quiet, organized, careful. He made sure no one talked too much, and no one talked to outsiders. One evening, in the back room of a restaurant in Queens, Joey met with his captains. The conversation wasn't about territory or money, it was about discipline. "We don't do drugs," he said firmly. "You touch that poison, you're out. I don't care who you are." Some younger guys shifted uncomfortably, tempted by the easy money of the drug trade. Joey noticed but didn't let it slide. "Fast money burns faster," he warned. "You want to live long, you play it slow." The Bonanno family under Joey became known as the most professional of the 5 families. They dressed modestly, avoided drawing attention, and ran their businesses like quiet corporations. Some law enforcement agents even joked that Joey ran the family like a CEO. He took pride in that. To him, the mafia wasn't chaos. It was structure, hierarchy, loyalty. But the peace began to waver when small betrayals started creeping in. A few soldiers got sloppy. One bragged too loud at a wedding. Another flashed money in front of the wrong crowd. Joey noticed everything. He didn't shout or threaten, he just remembered. And when people started disappearing from meetings, no one asked why. Everyone understood that silence was a form of mercy. Despite his control, Joey began to sense the pressure tightening around him. He noticed unfamiliar faces in cars parked on his street, phones that clicked at odd moments, strangers at the edge of crowds. The FBI had been after him for years, and though they had never caught him in anything concrete, he could feel their presence growing closer. He began to change his routines. No more fixed meeting spots, no predictable drives, no repeating routes home. His men joked that Joey had become paranoid, but paranoia in his world was survival. "If you're not a little paranoid," he once said to Sal Vitale, "you're already finished." Sal laughed, but even he could tell Joey was different these days. Colder, quieter, calculating more than ever. Their bond, once unbreakable, began to show cracks as well. Sal had always been loyal, but he was also ambitious. Being the underboss wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more recognition, more control. Joey sensed it, but said nothing. He had a way of letting tension simmer until it revealed itself naturally. Meanwhile, business was booming. The family controlled dozens of rackets across New York and beyond. Construction companies paid their dues, restaurants funneled cash, and illegal gambling flourished quietly. Every week, money came flowing in, thick envelopes stacked neatly on Joey's kitchen counter before being redistributed. He didn't celebrate. To him, money wasn't a trophy. It was proof that the system worked. Then came an unexpected problem. One of his closest captains, Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, was exposed years earlier for unknowingly welcoming an undercover FBI agent, Joe Pistone, known to the world later as Donnie Brasco. That single infiltration had humiliated the Bonanno family and led to countless indictments. Joey hadn't forgotten. He made it his mission to rebuild the family's reputation after that disaster. And now that ghosts of the past were being mentioned again in courtrooms, it stirred something in him. The Bonannos would never be seen as weak again. He swore that. As the years rolled on, Joey's control deepened. The other New York families respected him for bringing order where chaos had ruled. The newspapers rarely mentioned his name, but in back rooms and alleys, he was spoken of with quiet reverence. The man, they called him, the one who had tamed the Bonannos, but the law never forgot. The FBI had files stacked high with his name on them. Agents who had chased mobsters for decades knew Massino was their white whale. They tapped phones, followed cars, bugged restaurants. Nothing stuck. Joey was too careful. He didn't trust phones, didn't write things down, and he made sure everyone who spoke to him did so face to face, and even then, only in vague language. Yet even the sharpest men have blind spots. Joey's was trust. He believed Sal Vitale would never betray him. The same man who had stood beside him through wars and rebuilding now felt underappreciated. The tension grew quietly, almost invisibly. One cold winter night, Joey sat in his living room, the sound of a Mets game playing faintly on the TV. His wife brought him tea and asked softly, "You ever think about walking away?" He smiled tiredly. "You don't walk away from this life," he said. "You fade out or you get taken out. Either way, the game decides when it's over." He didn't know then that the game had already started to turn against him. The FBI was closing in, slowly, methodically, and somewhere in that tightening circle was a voice they never expected, a voice that would one day come from within Joey's own trusted circle. For now, though, he remained what he'd always been, the calm center of a dangerous world, the man no one dared to cross. But fate was moving quietly in the shadows, and Joey Massino, for all his brilliance, couldn't see that the first domino was about to fall. By the late 1990s, the air around Joey Massino seemed heavier. The streets still whispered his name with quiet reverence, but the world he had mastered was starting to change in ways even he couldn't fully control. The old codes that had kept the mafia alive for generations were eroding, replaced by greed, impatience, and betrayal. Joey could feel it like a sickness spreading through his empire. Everywhere he looked, he saw cracks forming. Men who once honored the code of silence now traded secrets for lighter sentences. Loyalty, once the foundation of everything, had become fragile. He sat in his office one night, an old cigar smoldering in an ashtray, flipping through. The ledger he kept more out of habit than necessity. Every page represented trust, men he'd vouched for, men who'd promised to die before they'd talk. But deep down, Joey knew that promise meant less than it used to. He tried to fight back the tide in the only way he knew, through discipline. "We don't talk to outsiders, not for any reason," he told his captains. "You get questioned, you forget your name." But even as he said it, he knew the FBI was getting smarter. They didn't need confessions anymore. They had wires, bugs, hidden cameras. Technology was replacing street smarts, and for the first time in decades, Joey felt the odds tilting away from him. The Bonanno family still made money, but it wasn't the same. The construction rackets were under federal investigation. The unions were crawling with informants. And the younger guys, kids who barely remembered the old wars, had no patience for quiet business. They wanted instant wealth. Joey had always believed slow money was safe money, but now his lectures fell on deaf ears. He confided one evening in Sal Vitale, the man he still called his brother. They sat in the back of a small Queens restaurant, plates of pasta between them. "You know what I hate, Sal?" Joey said. "These new guys, they think this life is about fame. They don't even know what respect means anymore." Sal nodded, though his eyes were somewhere else. "We can't stop the world from spinning," he said quietly. Joey didn't like the tone. It sounded like resignation. That night, as Joey drove home, he replayed Sal's words in his head. They bothered him. Sal had always been solid, but lately, something about him felt off. Joey brushed it aside, convincing himself that the years of pressure were making him see ghosts. He didn't yet realize that those ghosts were real, and that one of them would soon wear Sal's face. In 1999, the FBI launched Operation King's Court, a quiet, calculated investigation into the Bonanno family's upper ranks. They had learned from past mistakes. No grand raids, no public spectacle, just patience, recordings, wiretaps, informants. Every conversation, every phone call, every coded message was another thread in the web they were spinning around Joey. Still, Joey moved with his usual calm. He believed in systems, in planning, in control. He had avoided handcuffs for over 3 decades. He saw no reason to believe his luck would run out now. But behind the scenes, the agents were closing in. They had flipped soldiers, bookkeepers, even a driver or two. None of them could touch Joey directly. He was too insulated. But their stories painted a picture, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the Bonanno family was fracturing again. Some captains began arguing over territories. Others, tired of Joey's strictness, whispered that he was too cautious, that he didn't have the stomach for modern business. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. Instead, he let them talk, and quietly watched who joined which side. At home, Josephine noticed the change. Joey had always been a quiet man, but now he carried a kind of stillness that felt different. Tense, heavy, like a storm waiting to break. She found him staring out the kitchen window late at night, cigarette in hand, his reflection flickering in the glass. "You're thinking too much again," she'd say softly. He'd smile, but it never reached his eyes. "It's the only way I stay ahead." But the truth was, for the first time, Joey wasn't sure if he was ahead anymore. Too many variables, too many leaks, too many men who feared prison more than they feared him. In early 2001, things took a turn. One of his trusted capos, Frank Lino, was arrested and immediately flipped. He started naming names, captains, soldiers, even describing Joey's meeting patterns. When word reached Massino, he didn't explode. He just sat back in his chair, staring at the wall. "One rat becomes 2, he muttered. "Then it's a flood." He tightened the family again, cutting off contact, between crews enforcing stricter silence. He reminded his men that talking was suicide, but by then, fear was spreading faster than loyalty. Some of the younger members started disappearing, running, hiding from the life they once worshipped. Sal Vitale tried to reassure him. "They'll never get you, Joey. You're too smart for them." Joey smirked. That's what they said about Gotti. They both went quiet. The tension between them grew heavier each week. Joey could feel Sal's frustration. The man wanted more say in decisions, wanted to feel like an equal, but Joey had spent his life building this empire. He wasn't about to share the crown. "You're my underboss," he reminded Sal one evening. "That's not an insult, it's a privilege, don't forget that." Sal nodded, but something in his eyes had changed. A flicker of resentment, a tiny spark of rebellion that Joey, for all his instincts, missed. That same year, tragedy struck the underworld. Several longtime figures from other families were taken down by the FBI, and one of them, Anthony Sparrow, a respected capo, was sentenced to life. Joey attended his funeral quietly, surrounded by men who now looked smaller, older, and tired. The golden era was dying, replaced by wiretaps, snitches, and endless courtrooms. On the drive back, Joey said nothing. The car windows fogged with rain, and the radio played softly. Finally, he spoke. "They're not coming for soldiers anymore," he said to his driver. "They're coming for kings." It was a chilling truth, and soon enough, that prophecy would come to life. The agents who had spent years watching him were finally ready to move. His name was written on every report, every file, every plan. The last untouchable Don of New York was now their ultimate target. But Joey didn't know that yet. For now, he was still the boss, still the man who had outsmarted them all, still believing that his silence could save him. By the early 2000s, the silence that had once protected Joey Massino began to feel like a curse. For years, his careful, calculated world had kept him untouchable. But now, that same silence became a kind of isolation, a distance from the very men he needed to trust. The old codes were fading, The streets were louder, and the FBI's patience was finally paying off. On a cold morning in January 2003, Joey sat in his living room reading the newspaper. The headlines screamed about corporate scandals, war overseas, and a new kind of technology that made even the most private lives visible. He read it all quietly, sipping his coffee. "The world's changing, Josephine," he said without looking up. His wife, who was folding laundry nearby, nodded gently. "It's always changing, Joey. You just never liked when it does." She was right. He didn't. He built his life on control, and now everything was slipping through invisible cracks. He still moved with the same discipline. No phones, no loose talk, no unnecessary meetings, but deep down, he could feel the noose tightening. The FBI had eyes everywhere, and though they hadn't touched him yet, he could sense the pressure like thunder in the distance. For months, federal agents had been watching the Bonanno family from every angle. They had flipped multiple associates, including one of Massino's closest allies, who began secretly recording conversations. Each meeting, each coded phrase, each innocent chat about sports or business was quietly being translated into evidence. Still, Joey stayed calm. He'd been through storms before. Every decade brought a new threat, a new law, a new betrayal. He had survived them all. What he didn't know was that this time, the storm was coming from inside his own home. His empire was being eaten from within. Sal Vitale, his brother-in-law and longtime underboss, was under investigation. The FBI had built a massive case around him, enough to bury him for life. They approached him with a choice: prison forever or cooperation. Joey had always believed Sal would rather die than talk. But fear does strange things to men who've spent too long pretending they're fearless. In the early months of 2003, Joey noticed Sal becoming distant. He skipped meetings, avoided eye contact, spoke less. "You all right?" Joey asked him once during a short walk after Sunday dinner. Sal forced a smile. "Just tired, Joey. Long week." Joey nodded, but something about his tone unsettled him. Weeks later, in a quiet office downtown, Sal Vitale broke the oath he'd once sworn before God and family. He agreed to testify against his own boss, his brother-in-law, his mentor, his friend. It was the betrayal that Joey Massino had feared all his life, and it was already in motion before he even knew. In July 2003, as Joey sat down to lunch in his modest home, the front door burst open. Federal agents stormed inside, shouting his name. "Joseph Massino, FBI, you're under arrest." His wife froze, the plate in her hands clattering to the floor. Joey stood up slowly, his expression calm, almost eerily so. "Easy," he said. "No need to make a show." They cuffed him in front of his family, walked him past the neighbors, and placed him in the back of a black car. Joey didn't speak. He didn't even glance out the window. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. If it came, he would face it with silence. At the FBI office, agents laid out the charges: 7 murders, racketeering, illegal gambling, extortion. A lifetime's worth of accusations. Joey looked across the table at them, his eyes steady. "You've been chasing me for 40 years, he said quietly. "I hope it was worth the wait." The agents exchanged glances. They knew this wasn't a man who would break easily. While awaiting trial, Joey was placed in a high-security detention center. The walls were thick, the lights harsh, the nights long. He passed his time reading, praying, and thinking. Every now and then he'd glance at the guards or the other inmates and see the flicker of recognition in their eyes, some mix of respect and curiosity. This was the last of the real dons. Then came the shock that cut deeper than handcuffs ever could. His lawyer visited him one morning with a grim expression. "Sal flipped," he said quietly. Joey didn't react at first. He thought he'd misheard. But when the words sank in, something in his face changed. Not anger, just an ache, a kind of hollow disappointment. "Sal," he said softly. "My own brother?" The lawyer nodded. He's cooperating fully. That night, Joey lay awake on the thin prison mattress, staring at the ceiling. In 40 years of building, planning, surviving, this was the one thing he could never defend against: betrayal. He had outsmarted rivals, investigators, even death. But family had undone him. When the trial began in 2004, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every bench. The government presented witness after witness: former associates, old captains, bookkeepers, men who once called Joey the man. One by one, they turned on him, painting a portrait of the quiet mastermind behind decades of crime. Through it all, Joey sat still, his face unreadable. No sighs, no curses, no outbursts. Even when Sal took the stand, Joey didn't look away. Sal's voice trembled as he recounted their years together. Every memory turned into evidence. "He was like a brother to me," Sal said, his eyes glistening. "But he ran everything. Nothing happened without his word." When court adjourned that day, Joey leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "If he's the kind of man who can do that, maybe this life really is over." The trial dragged on for months. Outside, newspapers called him the last Don, the smartest boss in New York, the end of an era. Inside, Joey felt something shifting in himself. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about power or legacy or the streets. He was thinking about survival and about what kind of man he wanted to be when the world finally stopped calling him boss. He had always believed silence could save him, but now, facing life in prison and a mountain of betrayal, he began to wonder if breaking that silence might be his only way out. Joey Massino had lived his entire life believing silence was strength. It was the code he built his empire on, the same code he demanded from everyone around him. But now, in the cold monotony of a federal detention cell, silence began to feel like a sentence all its own. The walls echoed with whispers of betrayal, and each day brought new headlines, new names, new friends who had turned on him. By the summer of 2004, the weight of it all was crushing. He had spent decades controlling men, moving pieces on a board where loyalty was the only currency. But now that currency had collapsed. Everyone seemed to be cutting deals, saving themselves, rewriting history to look clean in the government's eyes. Even Sal, the man he had trusted like a brother, had traded his soul for a lighter sentence. Still, Joey carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. When guards escorted him down the gray corridors, he walked with steady steps, nodding politely. He never raised his voice, never complained. The younger inmates called him old school, and even the guards treated him with a strange kind of respect. He was a relic of a vanished world, one where men lived and died by their word. One evening, after dinner, Joey sat by the narrow window of his cell, watching the faint orange glow of the sunset spill over the prison yard. His lawyer, Edward Hayes, had visited earlier that day and laid it all out clearly. "Joey, they've got enough to bury you. You know that, right?" Hayes said, his tone a mix of exhaustion and sincerity. Joey had nodded. "They always think they got enough, until they don't." But this time, even he could sense the finality. The government had witnesses, tapes, paper trails. They were seeking the death penalty for some of the murders tied to him. It wasn't just a sentence, it was an execution order. That night, Joey lay in his bunk, staring into the dark, his thoughts restless. Death never scared him much, but dying like this, locked away, forgotten, reduced to a headline, felt like a hollow ending for a man who'd once ruled an empire. He turned over, shut his eyes, and whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. A week later, the prison buzzed with rumors. Someone said the feds had flipped another big name. Someone else whispered that Joey himself was considering it. At first, no one believed it. Joseph Massino, the boss of bosses, the man who preached silence. Impossible. But inside that cell, Joey had begun to think differently. The loyalty he'd defended all his life had become a weapon used against him. Every man he'd protected had turned into an informant. Every code he'd enforced had been broken by those who once swore it meant everything. The life he'd lived no longer existed. The streets weren't ruled by respect anymore. They were ruled by survival. When his lawyer returned a few days later, Joey surprised him. "Tell them I'll talk," he said quietly. Hayes blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. You mean cooperate? Joey, are you sure that's—" "I'm sure," Joey interrupted, his voice calm but heavy. "I gave my whole life to a code that don't mean nothing anymore. If the world changed, maybe I gotta change too." And with that single decision, history shifted. For the first time, an official mafia boss, a man who once commanded one of New York's 5 families, chose to cooperate with the government. It was unthinkable. The FBI agents who'd hunted him for decades could hardly believe it. When they met him in a small interrogation room, Joey was calm, almost businesslike. "You want to know how it worked?" he said, leaning forward slightly. "I'll tell you, but you treat me fair." Over the next several months, he spoke in measured tones, walking the agents through decades of mafia life. How money moved, how messages were sent, how decisions were made. He didn't rant or brag. He spoke like a man explaining an ancient trade that had lost its meaning. He even offered to help from the inside. While awaiting sentencing, he wore a hidden recorder, capturing conversations with other mobsters who were still pretending to be loyal. The FBI called it invaluable intelligence. Joey called it cleaning up the mess. Word of his cooperation spread like wildfire through the underworld. To some, he was a traitor of the highest order, the final nail in the coffin of the old mafia. To others, he was a realist, a man who saw the truth before anyone else did, that the code was dead long before he broke it. Inside prison, the reactions were mixed. Some inmates spat on the floor when they heard his name. Others looked at him with a strange kind of pity, maybe even admiration. "He's the last one who figured it out," a younger inmate whispered once. "He lived long enough to see what loyalty really costs." Joey didn't argue. He didn't try to justify it. He knew what he'd done, and he carried the weight of it quietly. There were no excuses, no speeches, just acceptance. When sentencing day came in 2005, the courtroom was packed again. Joey stood there, hands clasped, listening as the judge spoke. "Joseph Massino," the judge said, "you built a life of secrecy and control, but in the end, your own words brought that world to light." He was sentenced to life in prison, but his cooperation spared him the death penalty. As marshals led him away, he glanced once toward his wife in the gallery. She nodded faintly, her eyes filled with sadness and something else. Relief, maybe. For the first time in decades, there would be no more lies. In the months that followed, Joey adjusted to his new reality. He spent his days reading, writing, and occasionally talking to the agents who still came to ask questions. To them, he was a living archive, a man who'd seen it all, and finally, told it all. Yet, deep inside, the silence never left him. Even after he broke it, it clung to him like an old habit. Sometimes late at night, he'd sit in his cell and whisper to himself, "In the end, everybody talks. Some do it early, some do it late, but nobody stays silent forever." And with that, Joey Massino, the man who built an empire on silence, became the man who ended it with his voice. The days after his sentencing carried a strange quiet. The chaos had ended, the trials were over, and Joey Massino was no longer the man on the front page. In a way, he felt invisible again, but this time, it wasn't the protective kind of invisibility that had once shielded him from the law. This was the stillness of a man who had outlived his era. The newspapers moved on to new scandals, new names. The mob world had changed, and Joey was now just another old ghost haunting a system that barely remembered him. Inside his cell, he lived a life of routine. Morning coffee, exercise, reading, prayer. He spoke to his wife through letters and occasional visits. She was loyal in the way only someone who had survived the same storms could be. When she came, she brought news from the outside. Stories of relatives, old friends, the city he once ruled in silence. "It's all different now, Joey," she'd say softly. "The neighborhoods, the people, even the corner stores you used to walk past are gone." Joey would smile faintly. "Everything changes," he'd reply. "Even the streets forget who walked on them." But not everyone had forgotten. Once in a while, a guard or another inmate would approach him quietly, asking questions about the life. Some wanted to know what it was really like. Others just wanted to be near a man who'd once commanded an empire from the shadows. Joey never glorified it. "You want the truth?" he'd tell them. "It's not what you think. It starts like a dream. Money, respect, family. But it ends the same way for everybody. Empty, alone, and wondering when it all turned." He'd say it without bitterness, just calm certainty. Like a teacher delivering a lesson he'd learned too late. In the years that followed, the FBI continued to meet with him. They treated him as both an informant and a historian, someone who could help them understand the inner structure of an organization that no longer existed as it once did. Joey would sit across from them, sometimes for hours, answering questions with precision and patience. He had no reason to lie now. The power was gone. The secrets had already been sold for survival. What remained was perspective. During one of those meetings, an agent asked him, "Do you ever regret it? Talking, I mean." Joey leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "You know what I regret?" he said quietly. "I regret thinking loyalty was a shield. I taught men to die for silence, and most of them couldn't even live with it. So maybe the talking wasn't the mistake. Maybe the mistake was believing there was still something left to protect." The agent wrote the words down. Later, they'd quote that line in a report, calling it the most honest statement ever made by a mafia boss. As the years passed, Joey began to reflect more deeply on his past. He remembered the faces of men who'd stood beside him, some dead, some imprisoned, some now free but living as ghosts like him. He thought about Sal Vitale. The betrayal that once burned so sharply now felt like a dull ache. "He did what I ended up doing," Joey told his lawyer once. "Maybe we were both wrong, or maybe we were both just late to admit the truth." In 2013, after nearly a decade in custody, something unexpected happened. Because of his extraordinary cooperation and declining health, the government agreed to release him early. When he heard the news, Joey sat in silence for a long while. "So it ends like this," he murmured. "Not with a gunshot or a police raid, not with a lifetime behind bars, but with a quiet walk out the front gate." He was 70 years old when he stepped into the sunlight again. The world outside looked nothing like the one he'd left. The city had changed its face. New towers, new voices, new rules. Nobody whispered his name anymore. The younger generation barely knew who he was. He could walk down the street and blend into the crowd like an ordinary old man. For someone who had spent decades being watched, feared, and followed, that anonymity felt like freedom. He rented a small apartment in Queens, not far from where his story began. The walls were bare except for a few family photos. He lived quietly, cooking simple meals, taking walks in the evening. Sometimes people who recognized him would stop and ask for a story. He'd smile, shake his head, and say, "Stories are for those who still believe in endings. I'm still living mine." Neighbors saw him as polite but distant. He rarely talked about the past. When asked about his life, he'd change the subject or make a small joke. Inside, he carried the weight of his choices, but he didn't complain. Regret, he believed, was just another kind of prison, and he'd already served his time. In the solitude of his later years, he began writing notes for himself, reflections, lessons, and fragments of thought. One of them read, "Silence made me powerful, but truth made me free." That single line captured everything his life had become. The boy from Queens, who rose to control one of the most secretive crime families in America, who built his name on silence and strategy, had finally learned that the loudest sound in life wasn't a confession or a command, it was acceptance. When winter came, neighbors would sometimes see him sitting on his porch, bundled in a coat, staring out at the quiet street. The city hummed around him, the same city that once belonged to men like him. Now, it belonged to no one and everyone at once. Joey would sit there until the streetlights flickered on, then whisper to himself, "We all build something. Some build legacies, some build prisons. I built both." And with that, the last true dawn of New York faded into the silence he once ruled. Not as a king, not as a criminal, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to be human. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Joey Massino's small Queens apartment, painting thin golden lines across the wooden floor. He sat quietly at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee the same way he did every morning, slowly, methodically, as if each sip was part of a ritual to remind himself that time still moved forward. Outside, the city murmured with life. Kids on their way to school, delivery trucks rumbling, neighbors arguing about parking. The noise used to annoy him. Now, it was comforting. It meant he wasn't behind bars anymore. He had been out of prison for months, but the adjustment wasn't easy. The streets he once controlled now belonged to strangers. Technology had rewritten the rules of everything. Phones that could record a man's entire life, cameras on every corner, and a kind of openness that made the secrecy he once thrived on feel ancient. "No one hides anymore," he muttered one day, watching a group of teenagers recording themselves on their phones. Everyone's their own witness now. Joey's days had settled into a rhythm. Morning walks around the block, lunch at a small diner where the waitress called him Mr. Joe, evening strolls near the park. He had money saved, enough to live quietly. Most of it came from legitimate ventures he'd set up decades ago, investments hidden in plain sight. He wasn't rich by mob standards anymore, but he didn't need to be. Every now and then he received letters from people who wanted to write books or documentaries about his life. Some wanted him to confess, others wanted him to justify. He never replied. "The story's already told," he'd say softly. "Anything else is just noise." But at night, when the city quieted, memories crept back like ghosts. The faces of men who'd followed him, trusted him, feared him. They came to him in flashes. The dim light of old clubs, the laughter after midnight meetings, the coded handshakes and unspoken rules. Sometimes he could almost smell the cigar smoke, hear the clinking glasses, feel the weight of those years pressing against his chest. One evening, as he sat by the window with an old radio playing Sinatra softly in the background, he heard a knock on the door. It startled him. Visitors were rare. When he opened it, a young man stood there, mid-20s maybe, wearing a plain jacket and holding a notebook. "Mr. Massino?" the young man asked politely. "My name's Anthony. My grandfather knew you. He worked at one of your restaurants back in the day. I was wondering if I could talk to you for a bit. I'm writing a paper about, old New York." Joey studied him for a long moment. The kid looked nervous but respectful. "A paper, huh?" he said. "You know what they used to say about curiosity, kid?" Anthony swallowed. "That it's dangerous?" Joey smirked faintly. "Depends on who you're curious about." He let the kid in. They sat at the table, and for the first time in years, Joey talked, not about crimes or names or betrayals, but about the city itself. How it smelled in the summer, how deals used to be made in whispers, how respect was once worth more than money. The kid listened, wide-eyed, scribbling notes. "You ever miss it?" Anthony asked quietly after a while. Joey leaned back, his eyes distant. "Miss it?" he repeated. "Sometimes, yeah, but not the way you think. I miss the order, the code, even if it was broken. It gave people a purpose. Now everybody's chasing something, but no one knows what for. Back then, at least we knew who we were." The young man nodded slowly. "My generation doesn't believe in much," he admitted. "We just exist." Joey smiled faintly. Then maybe that's the problem. You can't build a life on nothing. Even I built mine on something, even if it was the wrong thing. They talked for over an hour. When the kid finally left, he thanked Joey sincerely. "You should tell your story," he said at the door. "Not the mob stuff, the lessons. People could learn from it." Joey watched him go, the echo of his words lingering in the room. Tell your story. He'd spent a lifetime keeping it buried, but maybe now that he was free from everything, telling it could be a way to make peace with it. That night, he took out an old notepad from a drawer and began to write. Not in the voice of a mob boss, but as Joseph Charles Massino, the man who had lived, lost, and learned. He wrote about growing up in Queens, about mistakes, about ambition, and about the emptiness of power. He didn't write names or dates, just moments and truths. His handwriting was shaky at first, but as the words flowed, he found something strange happening inside him. The guilt that had always lingered began to lift. He wasn't writing to justify or confess. He was writing to understand. Weeks passed. The notebook filled slowly. Every page was a mirror, reflecting a piece of his life he hadn't faced before. And with each word, the silence that had once defined him began to dissolve into something softer, understanding, even peace. One afternoon, he brought the notebook to the park and sat on a bench beneath a wide oak tree. The pages fluttered in the breeze as he read parts of it to himself. An elderly woman walking her dog stopped nearby. "You writing a memoir?" she asked with a friendly smile. Joey chuckled. "Nah," he said. "Just writing down what I should have learned sooner." She smiled. "Then that sounds like a memoir to me." When she walked away, Joey leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind rustling through the leaves. For the first time in decades, he felt light. Not free from his past, he knew that was impossible, but free from the need to hide from it. He thought about all the years he'd spent mastering control, only to discover that the greatest peace came from letting go. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm orange tones, he whispered softly to himself, maybe silence was never the answer. Maybe the real power was in knowing when to speak. That night, when he went home, he placed the notebook by his bedside and turned off the light. Sleep came easily, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, his dreams weren't filled with faces or regrets, just the quiet hum of the city he had finally made peace with. The morning light in Queens was soft and pale, creeping through the half-open blinds of Joey Massino's small apartment. He awoke to the sound of pigeons tapping against the window and the distant hum of traffic below. The city was already awake, full of movement and noise, but his life had slowed into something simple, peaceful even. He sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his knees, and took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he didn't need to worry about meetings, messages, or men watching his every step. He made himself a small breakfast, black coffee, 2 eggs, toast. He sat by the window as he ate, glancing at the worn notebook on the table beside him, the one he'd been filling with reflections and memories. It had become a quiet obsession, his own way of keeping time. Each page captured another fragment of his story, but not the kind of story the world knew him for. There were no headlines in those pages, only lessons. Some nights, he'd read back through them, shaking his head at the man he once was. He wrote about greed, loyalty, the illusion of power, about how men like him had mistaken fear for respect and silence for wisdom. "We were kings of nothing," he wrote once. "We built castles out of shadows, then wondered why they disappeared when the sun came up." The writing didn't change his past, but it softened something in him. He'd spent so many years mastering control, living behind masks, pretending that emotions were weaknesses. Now, in his old age, he finally allowed himself to feel everything: regret, gratitude, loneliness, even a quiet sort of pride for surviving what so many others hadn't. That afternoon, Joey decided to take a walk to his old neighborhood in Maspeth. He hadn't been there since before his arrest. The streets were different now. New storefronts, new faces, but the bones of the place were the same. He stopped by a small bakery that stood where an old social club used to be. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air, replacing the thick haze of cigar smoke that once clung to those walls. He ordered a cannoli and sat by the window looking out at the street. A few older men sat at another table nearby, laughing over espresso. They reminded him of the old crew, faces from another life. For a fleeting moment, he saw the ghosts of his past sitting there, younger, louder, invincible. He smiled faintly, as if greeting them one last time. The young woman behind the counter approached him. "You come here often, sir?" she asked politely. "Not anymore," Joey said with a small smile. "But I used to come around here a lot, long time ago. Different crowd back then." She smiled. "Well, you picked the right day. The coffee's on the house for anyone with stories." Joey chuckled. "I've got a few of those," he said, taking a sip. "But they're not the kind people want to live through twice." As the afternoon sun warmed the street outside, Joey walked slowly past the block where everything had once begun. The old club was gone, the grocery store had turned into a cell phone shop, and the corner where deals were once whispered now had a security camera watching from above. "Times change," he murmured. "And maybe it's better that way." On his way home, he passed a small playground. Children were laughing, their voices filling the air. He stopped for a moment, leaning on the fence, watching them chase each other in the fading light. There was something pure in that sound, innocent, unburdened. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of world they would grow up in. Maybe one without men like him shaping its shadows. That night, he opened his notebook again and wrote, "Power fades, fear fades, even names fade. But the choices stay. Every man leaves echoes, some loud, some quiet. I spent half my life being feared and the other half trying to be forgotten. Maybe peace isn't about erasing what you were. Maybe it's about accepting it without letting it define what's left." He closed the notebook gently and stared at it for a long time. He thought of his wife, who had stood by him even when everything fell apart. He thought of his daughters, who had built their own lives far from his shadow. He didn't hear from them often, but that was okay. He didn't blame them for keeping their distance. Maybe silence this time was their way of healing. Weeks passed quietly. He spent his mornings at the park, afternoons writing, and evenings listening to old records. Sinatra, Martin, Bennett, the same songs that had once played in smoky lounges where he sealed his fate. Now they were just melodies of memory, reminders of a life lived too fast and too hard. One evening, he ran into a familiar face at the park, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes. They recognized each other instantly, even after all these years. "Joey?" the man said, smiling with disbelief. "It's really you?" Joey laughed softly. "Depends who's asking." The man's name was Frankie, an old acquaintance from the neighborhood, one of the few who hadn't disappeared or gone bad. They sat on a bench and talked for hours, about family, the old days, how everything changed. "You know," Frankie said, "we all used to think you'd never make it out alive. But here you are." Joey shrugged. "Guess I outlived the life." Frankie smiled. "And what do you do with that kind of second chance?" Joey looked out at the skyline, the city glowing beneath the setting sun. "You live quiet," he said. "You listen more. You learn that winning isn't about staying on top. It's about finding peace after you fall." That night back home, he added another note to his journal. "When I was young, I wanted to be untouchable. Now I just want to be remembered as a man who finally understood." He placed the notebook back on the table next to his cup of cold coffee and smiled to himself. The city outside buzzed with life, but for the first time in decades, Joey felt like he didn't have to chase it. He had already found what he'd been running toward all along. Peace, quiet, understanding. The final years of Joey Massino's life unfolded like the quiet end of a long film. No violence, no betrayal, no flashing headlines, just the slow fade of a man who had finally made peace with himself. He'd lived through everything the underworld could throw at him: power, loss, fear, loyalty, and the price of every lie ever told. Yet somehow, in the soft rhythm of ordinary days, he found what he never had during the height of his empire: calm. He began his morning sitting by the window, coffee steaming beside him, a small radio playing Sinatra or Dean Martin in the background. Outside, the city pulsed with the same energy it always had, but it no longer called to him. Once, that hum of New York had been his lifeblood, the signal that the world was moving according to his plans. Now, it was just music in the distance, a tune that belonged to someone else's time. Sometimes he'd catch himself thinking about the old days, the secret meetings, the coded messages, the tense conversations in dimly lit rooms. The life he led had been one long chess game, and he'd played every piece like a master. But what he never saw back then was that in the end, even the king falls. Not by an opponent's hand, but because the game itself ends. Joey didn't talk much about the past to anyone. The people who knew it were either gone, moved away, or had learned to forget. His wife, Josephine, visited when she could. They'd sit together in the living room, sharing quiet meals and memories that didn't need retelling. She would sometimes look at him, her eyes filled with a kind of love only time can polish, one that had endured everything. "You ever think it was worth it?" she asked him once. He thought for a long moment before answering. "It was what it was," he said softly. "I thought I was building something that would last forever. Turns out forever shorter than I thought." She smiled sadly and took his hand. "You still have today," she said. And for Joey, that was enough. He started visiting a local church, slipping quietly into the back pew on Sunday mornings. He didn't pray for forgiveness. He didn't believe life worked that easily. But he prayed for peace. For the people he hurt, for the men who followed him into the storm, and even for himself, who had once believed he was unstoppable. He never spoke to the priest, never confessed. But one morning, as sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, he felt something shift inside, a quiet acceptance. Maybe that was enough. One day, a young man approached him outside the church. Joey recognized that look immediately. Eager, restless, hungry for power. He reminded Joey of himself at 25. "Mr. Massino," the kid said nervously, "I've heard stories about you. You were something else back in the day." Joey smiled faintly. "Stories are like smoke, kid," he said. "They look solid from far away, but try to hold them, and they disappear." The boy hesitated. Still, it must have felt good being the boss. Joey studied him for a long time before answering. "It feels good until it doesn't. You'll spend your whole life trying to prove you're untouchable. But you know what's worse than being caught?" The kid shook his head, realizing that in the end no one even wants to touch what you built. He walked away, leaving the young man with more silence than words. That encounter stayed with Joey for days. Maybe it was life's last little irony, seeing his younger self in the eyes of someone just starting to chase the same illusions. As months passed, his health began to fade. Nothing dramatic, just the steady decline of time. His steps grew slower, his handwriting shakier, but every day he still wrote in that same notebook. By now it was nearly full. Hundreds of pages of thoughts, confessions, and lessons written not for the world, but for whoever might stumble upon them someday. One winter evening, snow began to fall over the city. The streets outside glowed under lamplight, and Joey sat by the window wrapped in a blanket, watching the flakes drift down like ashes from an old fire. He opened his notebook one last time and wrote carefully, his hand trembling slightly. "In the end, all that matters is who you become after you've lost everything that made you someone." He closed the notebook gently and set it aside. On the table sat a photo of him and Josephine from decades ago, young, smiling, untouched by the years that would follow.